welcome to this tutorial video for Prog 1210 Rapid Application Development. In this video, we're going to be modifying our insert form so that instead of making use of the DB set for musicians, we're going to instead use a stored procedure from our database. Now, if we take a look at our DB context object, you can find it in the file bandmodel.context.cs. You'll see that this is the class that creates and holds all of our objects from the database. So you can see we've got our two DB sets, the set of instruments from the instrument table and the set of musicians from the musician table. We also have a set of objects that come from the view. But below that we have our functions that are mapped to stored procedures in our database. So for example, the instrument list executes a stored procedure called instrument list. And we have functions that match up with all the stored procedures in our database that we selected when we created our entity. So the one that we're interested in right now is musician insert. And you can see here that the musician insert function takes parameters for musician first name, musician last name, birth date, practice day, and musician's instrument ID. It also takes this object parameter, musician ID. The musician ID parameter is mapped as the output parameter in the stored procedure. So that's going to be returned back to us after we execute the procedure. You'll also notice that the return type of this procedure is int. This is because it returns an integer representing whether or not our stored procedure was successful. So what that means is when we execute this stored procedure with our code, we'll have two different types of output that we can use after. The int that's returned from the function and the musician ID that is returned from the stored procedure. In this function, it checks to make sure that all of our parameters exist and then executes the musician insert stored procedure from the database. In order to make use of this, I'm going to go back into our click event for the insert button. This was coded up in the previous video. We're going to make some changes now. Instead of using the DB set object, we're going to go straight to the database and execute that stored procedure through our stored procedure function in the DB context object. So what that means is I don't need to create this new musician object and modify the database anymore. So I'm just going to comment out all of that. And instead, I'm going to call the function that represents the stored procedure. Now the first thing that I need is that object parameter. If we switch back, you'll recall that we need this object parameter for the musician ID that can be returned from the procedure. So I'm going to create the object parameter as follows. We'll create a new variable. So we have to go through quite a few levels here before we can get to it. It's an object parameter. We'll give it the name of musician ID to match up with the name from the other function. And we'll give it an initial value of 0. Oh, and we just need to add in our new keyword here. So we create this new object parameter object. And what we're going to do with it is send it through to our stored procedure function. So we're still looking in the DB object, but now instead of looking at the musician's classes, we're going to look at the musician insert function. And you can see from the IntelliSense that it's expecting all of these values, and we already have the values that we captured from the user's input. So we can just use our IntelliSense to help us by passing them in order. So we're going to pass the first name first, then the last name, then the birth date, then the practice, the instrument ID, and finally our object parameter, which we've called random. So this little function call here will execute the stored procedure with the input that we want. and we want to capture the result, so I'm going to create an integer to hold that resulting value. And if we like, we can use that resulting value to test to see whether our procedure was successful or not. What I'm going to do instead is look at our param object to grab the output from the stored procedure. Because that object parameter is now, after the database is finished executing that stored procedure, the parameter is going to hold that musician ID, because in our database object, the musician ID is an output parameter. So what I'm going to do here is, in my label feedback, I'm going to add in the value of the musician's ID that was just inserted. So instead of insert successful, we can say musician inserted with ID, and then we'll add on at the end the value of that parameter. So we'll go into our param object, look at its value, and you'll see the value starts off as an object. So if we want to put it into a label, we're going to have to convert it to a string, like so. So you'll notice that we don't need the save changes anymore, because this actually executes right against the database stored procedure. So we don't have to worry about flushing our changes to the database, but we still do need the data bind to update the grid view. So we can execute this now. And we'll attempt to insert another musician. So our site should operate the same when we make an attempt to insert a new person. We'll add some information in here. And we'll click on add, and our new musician shows up at the bottom. In the next video, we'll describe how to make changes to the grid view so that our edit and delete functions use the stored procedures as well.